If you met me on the street and asked me what my job was, I would tell you that I work from home consulting for an industrial laundry company. That is, after all, the cover story I've been provided with. The reality, my job is even simpler. Every Friday night, I dress up nice, report to a certain theater downtown, have a seat, and watch a performance. That's it. All it takes is a couple hours out of my week, and I end up making 6 figures a year with every benefit you could possibly ask for. I know. It sounds too good to be true. Pretty much anybody on the planet would kill to have a job like mine. At least perhaps, until they find out just what kind of performances I'm made to attend. Before I start though, I need you to keep in mind that I'm a good person. I donate thousands to the Rainforest Fund out of every paycheck, and me and my kids volunteer at the food bank weekly. I'm a devout believer and I'm going to heaven when I die. After all, I myself have never hurt anybody, never raised a hand to injure any living soul. How could you possibly call me a sinner when all I ever do is watch? It started about 3 years ago when their job offer found me when I was at my most desperate. All I was told was, every Friday night I would attend a performance at my city's fanciest theater. That was it. I was baffled at first. What the hell do I know about theater or ballet or orchestras? Had they gotten me mixed up with some big shot critic? During our talk on the phone, however, they politely reassured me that no critical ability would be required. All we ask, they said, is for you to be there to bear witness. Everything about it screamed a scam, but I figured, what the hell? Worst case scenario, I listened to a pitch for some MLM or timeshare, politely decline, and then walk out with some pocket money. I was baffled when I pulled up to the theater. Dozens, maybe even hundreds of people were streaming in, all in nice suits and gorgeous gowns. I'd thrown on the fanciest clothes I could afford, yet I still felt severely underdressed. The theater was totally rented out by my employer, and only my fellow co-workers were allowed in. How much could it have cost to hire such a massive crowd just to attend this one performance? Who could possibly bankroll something like this? I tried to empty my mind and simply merge into that human tidal wave flowing through the doors. Every staff member was dressed in a refined all-black suit, with a black tie and undershirt, to the point they seemed to darken the air around them. Each wore a white comedy mask, the neoprene stretched into a grin of perpetual laughter, which struck me as almost mocking. They demanded that we hand over all electronic devices, even patting us down and running a metal detector over us. Then they reminded all attending not to leave their seats under any circumstances during the performance, recommending we take bathroom breaks before the show started, and to remain quiet and to keep our eyes open. They kept repeating the same mantra. No distractions, no diversions, no lapses in concentration. Remember, you are here to bear witness. If I'd been alone, I would have left right then and there. There was a tickling in the back of my brain, some primate part of me screaming that there was something terribly wrong here. But mob mentality is a hell of a thing. Everybody else seemed calm, nonplussed, handed their phones over without a fuss. There were a few holdouts, probably other newbies like me, but eventually they too relented. If everyone else is going along with it, I figured, why shouldn't I? Who wants to be the one single paranoid bastard who missed out on an easy paycheck? Stepping into a gorgeous theater like something out of 3 centuries ago, I was most struck by the make of the stage. It looked like the back action of a piano. Strange levers and mahogany hammers looking like fingers manipulating countless lines of piano wire, some over a dozen feet long. All the taut wires stretched in bizarre formations across the stage reminded me somehow of a spider's web. I could not fathom a machine so complex, yet with such little apparent purpose. The nature of the performance always varies. Sometimes it's a work of Shakespeare, a ballet, an opera, hell, even a puppet show. That day it was a concert featuring a small chamber orchestra of around 35. Students, it looked like, young and inexperienced, with a nervous air about them as if this was their first time performing before such a crowd. Mostly a string section, plus one of each woodwind, and just a couple each on horns and percussion. The conductor was one of the staff members in the comedy masks. I was baffled. Who would put forward this much cash just for a small green orchestra to play in such a massive, prestigious venue? One of them must be a billionaire's kid, I figured. It was the only explanation. This, I've since realized, is always the best part. The beginning of the performance when you can, if you try, lose yourself in the display and pretend everything is okay, that it's all normal. It was best on those lucky days when the performers on stage were completely unaware of just what sort of danger they were in. That always makes it easier for everybody. On that first day, I was as oblivious as they were and simply enjoyed the music. Maybe some snob of the orchestral arts would hear their amateurish mistakes, but to my untrained ear they sounded just fine, pleasant even. But one question began to worm its way into my head, a small nagging at first, which crescendoed into a hammering on the inside of my skull. How much time has passed? At a certain point, I suspected the intermission was long overdue. But there were no windows, and I had to part with my electronic wristwatch at the door, so really getting any sense of time was impossible. I dismissed it as my lousy attention span at first, but eventually others began taking notice. No one dared speak, but among the fellow newbies I noticed furrowed brows and sideways glances, confused and concerned. The performers seemed to be getting restless as well, whispering and gesturing to each other and the conductor, who never ceased those robotic, sweeping motions of his gloved hands. It must have been 2 hours by then, if I had to guess, and they were starting to look exhausted, dehydrated. Some even looked as if they were about to quit playing.
Continue performing.
In a moment, all of the piano wire loudly reverberated and stretched taut with the movements of those mechanical contraptions on stage, as the whole thing bristled and tensed as though it were a living thing. And that voice, cracking like thunder, seemed to emerge from the stage itself with a mechanical roar like the grinding of metal on metal. That seemed to frighten them into submission for a while. It wasn't until a half hour later that my life changed irreparably. They had been playing a quiet sonata, so everybody could hear the sudden pop of a string snapping, accompanied by a pained yelp. My eyes leapt to one of the violinists. One of her strings had broken and happened to snap her right in the eye. I could see the streak of scarlet bifurcate her pupil, before the emerging blood replaced the entire eye with a thick redness. She stood, clutching a hand over her eye and blindly grasping with the other, gesturing for medical help. And as she did so, that strange lattice of levers and hammers and pulleys all roared and clacked to life, like a bear trap being sprung. The machine's efficacy was just as sudden, just as brutal. Those clockwork edifices moved like a pair of robotic arms, aiming a wire for her neck as if trying to garrote her. But they moved at such a speed that the wire seemed to pass through her like she wasn't even there. For a moment she seemed fine, unaffected, as if nothing had happened at all. And then things began to fall off of her. Her head, severed at the neck alongside the hand she'd been holding over her eye, and the very fingertips of her other hand with which she'd been grasping a little too high. All had been cut cleanly with surgical precision. Time seemed to slow as they all went clattering wetly to the floor, and the girl's body soon followed, as if it took a few moments for gravity to set in. or perhaps for her body to realize she was dead. It happened so fast it was hard to be properly horrified. It was more like awe, maybe. Everybody stared at the chunks of meat that had once been a promising young woman with hopes and dreams. That spider web of wires was still rumbling and shaking all around them, and the mechanical voice roared once more.
Continue performing.
They were given no further warnings. A few of them jumped from their seats out of sheer instinct, not even thinking. None of them made it more than a step before the wires divided them in twain. The rest just kept playing exactly as they had been, as if their brain froze up at what they'd witnessed and simply ran on autopilot, until their faculties slowly returned to them, and they realized that this instinct had saved their lives. Where once beauty filled the room, now the orchestra had been reduced to a discordant sound like a long, shuddering whine, like a mocking parody of music. They gripped their instruments with trembling, sweaty hands, playing just well enough to avoid stoking the ire of those quivering wires stretched taut all around them. They realized gradually that they were allowed to speak. Immediately, they began wailing hard enough almost to mercifully drown out that dismal cacophony that was once music, some begging and pleading with the staff, others screaming out threats, be they legal or physical. Nothing they said could shake the masked men and women in the slightest. They stood at order like statues, unflinching. Realizing this, they turned their attention to us, a wall of red, weepy eyes scanning the crowd for any hint of mercy, begging us to band together against the staff, calling us all sick bastards for just sitting there and watching them die. A blonde woman on violin had the most genius and cruel strategy of all. She merely began telling us about herself. Everything she could think of poured out in between sniffles and tears. "My name is Vera Hayes. That's my husband over there." She gestured to a dark-haired man on drums. He'd been the quietest of them all, seeming to be saving his strength. "We have a little girl. She's 8 years old and she loves her mama and papa. Her name is Lucy. She loves horsies and I was saving up to maybe give her riding lessons one day." I desperately wanted to cover my ears but knew it would be against the rules. Why can't she just shut the hell up? I thought bitterly, grinding my teeth. I truly hated her more than I'd ever hated before. But why? Some dim remnant of my reason asked, "She's a victim here, she's done you no wrong." But I realized I hated her because she kept reminding me she was human, reminded me of what I was doing to her, what we all were doing to her, sitting here in complicity. And it almost worked too. I almost resolved to save her. But then came the boom of a gunshot from far behind me. The shot had come from one of the tragedians standing amid the upper gallery. I was certain. I almost made the mistake of looking back. Instead, I kept my eyes locked forward and merely imagined who it was that just had their brains splattered across their seat. Had they snuck a phone in and tried calling 911? Had they tried making a break for it? Or maybe they just couldn't take it anymore and made the fatal decision to look away from the horror. I tried to distract myself by studying the impossible mechanism animating the blood-soaked piano wire. I couldn't figure it out. It was an impossible machine, existing in defiance of all basic laws of geometry and seemed to have no means of controlling it, instead operating automatically with some malign intelligence. Perhaps it was an extension of whatever creature composed the stage itself. It was a living thing, of that much I was certain. It breathed beneath the performers, and their blood soaked into its floorboards in moments, as if consumed. After some hours, the orchestra had gone quiet, having screamed themselves hoarse. I couldn't imagine being in their shoes. Even just watching them perform was a test of endurance. Many of them were oozing blood all over their instruments, from scarlet cuts where the skin had split. The woman on the French horn was struggling hardest of all, her lungs and hands burning with exhaustion. I can't, she eventually cried out in a hoarse little wheeze, horns slamming to the floor as her body gave out. I'm so sorry, I can't do any. A wire passed through flesh in an instant, and suddenly she had no mouth to speak, no eyes to see, no mind to think with. All of it lay splattered upon the stage, which sated itself upon that spilled vitae. Another gunshot. I quivered in my seat, sweat beading on my forehead from the terror. Somebody in the audience had looked away, and I realized I had just been about to do the same thing, had the sudden sound not knocked me out of my stupor. Most of the performers went in similar ways, over the next few hours, either making mistakes or their bodies giving out. As monstrous as it may sound, I was quietly praying for them to get it over with. They were dead the moment that they walked on stage. Why drag it out for all these hours just for the inevitable to happen anyway? I recognize now that it's almost impossible to make that choice, to simply give in and accept death in defiance of all our natural instincts. But the auditorium now reeked from audience members voiding their bowels, and the damn woman next to me just wouldn't stop crying, wouldn't stop at all. Vera and her husband lasted the longest of all, perhaps because they had each other. Over a dozen hours had passed, maybe even 2, and they were still playing a little duet in perfect sync despite everything. By now they were simply talking to each other as if nothing was wrong, as if we weren't even watched. Baby, when we get out of here, I'm going to take you to Martha's Vineyard. I know I've been saying that for so long, but God, I wasted so much money on that stupid motorcycle, he said. Lucy's going to love it. Vera chuckled. I don't know. It might be boring for a little girl. Isn't it all a bunch of old people up there? He laughed weakly. Oh, maybe in town. But you know her, once you get her in the water, you can't get her back out. She's a natural-born swimmer, I swear. Think we'll see her in the Olympics someday. It was surreal to watch, like I was peeking in on a private conversation a couple was having in their own home. But I could tell both of them were trying to maintain some illusion of normalcy, anything to keep themselves psychologically intact as the hours pass. Even as they tried to smile and laugh, there was a quiver in their tone, a desperation, a fear of what might happen if there was a single break in the conversation. A lot of what they said was too personal to relay here. They went into old regrets, past mistakes, resolved every argument they ever had in all their years together. It was like they wanted to make sure they said everything they had to say before the end came. I think I owe them at least their privacy. The husband was slowly deteriorating. He had moved too quick and caught the cymbal with his hand, leaving a wide gash along his palm that was gushing blood at a terrifying rate. Now he was getting woozier and woozier, swaying dizzily, his eyes unfocusing, his speech becoming slurred and his playing sloppy. Vera desperately tried to keep him focused. Talk to me, baby. Think of the beach. Lucy's going to love the seashells. She'll pick her favorite and put it on that little stand in her room, with all her little trophies. She rambled on, but by the end, all he could manage was half-hearted grunts of affirmation. He was leaning in his seat, and then his drumstick went flying right out of his hand, sending a cloud of pink mist through the air along its path. And yet he kept going through the motions of playing, as if he didn't even notice. Then a sudden clarity formed in his eyes, and he stared at his empty hand in disbelief. And then the piano wire was tensing and strumming all around him. And then in an instant he was up from his seat and racing towards us. He knew it was over. He just wanted to strike out at the world if he could. One last act of defiance. He even locked eyes with me, and I'll never forget the look on his face. Why are you watching this, you sick bastards, you sick, twisted... He threw his remaining drumstick, and the trajectory would have delivered it right to me. But the piano wires lacerated it in midair, slicing into it from 100 different directions until it disappeared into a cloud of sawdust. And then they did the same to him. Vera didn't scream or sob. She just tensed and let out the tiniest little gasp, like when you're at the doctor's and know the shot is inevitable, but it still stings anyway. And then she was all alone. She looked at us like she wanted to speak, wanted to say something, to express what was happening inside her. But what was there left to say? She'd spent almost a full day screaming herself hoarse with every combination of words she could think of. None of it helped. None of it meant anything. Instead, she expressed herself through music. She began to play the most mournful, sobering solo I had ever heard. One I knew she was making up as she went along. One with which she communicated those parts of herself that words could not encompass. She stared us all down, eyes red and bloodshot, making eye contact individually as if to remind us that we were not a shapeless mass, that we were all individually responsible. I only barely remember the sound of it now, as if I had heard it in a dream. And yet even now the memory tears at my heart. She performed for what felt like an eternity. And then in the end, she slowly, calmly set down her violin, stood up and took a bow, and then she was unmade. Everyone stood up around me all of a sudden, and I was immediately caught up in it too, performing a standing ovation that dragged on and on. We screamed, shouted, cried, threw things, smashed our fists against seats, tore at our hair, laughed and danced with each other. It was the ultimate catharsis after all that silence, after a full day of holding it all in. Never before had I felt so connected to a crowd of people on some deep, spiritual level. We marched out of the theater, stumbling like a procession of ghouls with blank faces and tired eyes. The staff were as polite as ever, thanking us for attending the performance and hoping that we enjoyed the show. Some were dragging the bodies of shot audience members out of the theater. As I finally emerged into the outside world, I was stunned to find it was still the same night I had entered. At least 20 hours had passed inside that theater, I was sure of it. But for the outside world, only 2 hours had passed, exactly the duration listed on their job offer. I had never been explicitly told not to reveal what I'd seen there, and now I knew why. Nobody believed me, or worse, maybe they were covering it up. I swear to God the police dispatcher laughed at me over the phone. I swore I'd never go back. I'd been part of something evil, something unfathomable, and it would haunt me forever. But the next year was one of constant desperation, debt climbing as job opportunities declined at equal rates. I held out for about a year, but eventually I gave in. And to my horror, the next performance was easier, now that I knew what to expect. And then the next was easier still, and the next. The performance is always different, but the end result is always the same. I have to remind myself that I'm not culpable for what they're doing there. All I do is watch. We watch people die every day in the news and online, people suffering horrible fates often in places our own countries help to destabilize. How are my actions any different, really? We all have to accept that terrible things happen in this world, and all we can do about them is either look away or look the horror right in the eye. Is choosing to look away more moral, or is it only more cowardly? And besides, wouldn't it be worse for them if there wasn't an audience? If they had to die there in the dark alone? No one seeing, no one caring, no one remembering. After all, someone has to bear witness.